let's get started. Natalie, I don't know if you want, or I don't know if you have Andrew's number to text him and see, like remind him sometimes. I think Elaine can't come on these days. I don't know if she got in touch with you, but let's just get started. It is 6:35. Call us to order. Julie's not here either, so I will be Julie too. I will roll call us in. Natalie Salee.
Here.
Brian Brzezinski.
Here.
Diane Anton. Matthew Mitchell. I don't know if I'm supposed to call you Commissioner. And then I don't call Jung or Aisha in, correct?
I don't think so.
Okay.
That's correct.
All right, so Matt, if you don't mind doing the motion to go through Zoom.
Great. I made the decision that it's infeasible to meet in person, and in light of the governor's COVID-19 proclamation, we will conduct this open meeting via Zoom.
Thank you. Right, we've got no one here. Natalie, have you gotten any citizen comments ahead of time?
No, I did post about it with the Day of Healing post that Aisha had sent me. I included that we were meeting tonight, but no, I did not. And I did just send a reminder email to the other committee members that this is the link for tonight.
Thank you.
The meat's in the microwave.
All right, well then I will turn all of this over to you, Aisha. Thank you so much for doing this for us. I have to admit, I have been a little busier these last few years, and I haven't been able to do, as many of these as I would like. So I'm very excited for tonight.
Thank you, Jessie. I'm excited too, and it's also fitting that we're kicking off this training series the same week as MLK Day, which we all know Martin Luther King fought for racial equity in our country and civil rights, as well as the day of National Racial Healing, which was on Tuesday. So it's fitting that this falls within that same week. I'm going to share my screen. Actually, I think I have to become the host or the co-host to be able to share my screen.
Okay, let me look at that.
Okay. Right. Okay, so our training will be guided with this PowerPoint. It will be a mix of sort of didactic learning, experiential, there'll be some video. Really, the hope and aim is that we're learning through a variety of modalities. The goal of the training series overall is to create a foundation for diversity, equity, and inclusion work at Ridgeville. The training, the overall aim is for us to leave with a common language. It's to encourage us to move into spaces of being reflective, and then also identifying tools that will help us along the way to integrate new practices, to think about best practices when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and then also to identify some strategies that will be helpful for us. The series is going to occur over 3 distinct learning sessions over the next few weeks. I'm going to start by introducing myself. I am Aisha Robinson. I'm a board certified dance movement therapist and also a licensed clinical professional counselor. I'm the founder of Bella Consulting Group. I will talk a little bit about dance therapy because we will engage our bodies at some point during this training. Dance therapy is a holistic therapeutic treatment approach that honors the mind, body, and spirit connection. So the idea is that our minds and our bodies and spirits are all connected. And so in order to treat a person, to address how we exist in our world, we have to address all of those parts. I have been working in this DEI space for over a decade and doing a variety of things from training, developing training content, developing course curriculum, and consultation. Overall, I have been a professor in higher education. I've trained nationally on a variety of topics, developed curriculum for organizations and universities alike, and have done this work as a consultant on a national basis. So working with companies and organizations across the United States. I'm going to give us an overview of what this training series will look like and entail. We're going to talk about norms and agreements, so how we show up in this space. We're going to talk about the equity charter. We'll talk about the idea of conflict management and conflict transformation. We'll look at some key terms and definitions, and that'll be connected to how we develop this common language and common ground. We're going to do some deeper dives on a few of those definitions and terms. We're going to talk about a racial equity lens, what it is, and the bridge between the READY Committee and the board. And then we'll also focus specifically on race and park spaces and this idea of reimagining public space. So we're going to be visiting a variety of different topics throughout this entire training. And I do want to say that throughout the training, it will be grounded in addressing racial equity. So we'll always come back to that. And the focus on race is purposeful because we know there are other isms in our society. And I'll repeat this a few times throughout the training because it's important to think about why race. But we know at the intersection of those identities that when we think about race and lived experiences, research and data, all those outcomes shift when race is included as a component of identities, which calls for a need for greater focus, intervention, and intention there. So let's talk about our agenda for today. It is ambitious, and so we'll see how far we get. We'll talk about some norms and agreements. We'll talk about the why of why we're doing this training. We'll look at some components of the equity charter. We'll talk about the concept of conflict transformation and conflict management, and then we'll begin to look at some of our terms. One of the things that I do want to make sure before I dive into norms is that everyone has something to write with. There'll be some moments throughout this training that I'll ask you to do reflection. There'll be specific questions. So take a moment now if you need to grab something to write with, and I'll wait a couple of seconds. Okay. So what you have on your screen are norms. And it's important when we think about creating space for conversations around issues connected to diversity, connected to race, connected to equity, that we're thinking about how to intentionally show up in the space, how we intentionally want to share space. And so what I'm posing here are some general norms about how we can exist in this space. And I'll read through them. Assuming best intentions and owning our impact. Sharing from a place of our own experience and perspective. So not speaking on behalf of others or for others and not being a spokesperson. Expecting and accepting non-closure. Monitoring my airtime and landing the plane. This is if we get into some discussion. Asking questions and respecting and honoring levels of transparency, as well as being an active participant in the training. And being an active participant is determined by how you desire to show up, whether that is coming off of mute and sharing a comment in a chat, or really being engaged and involved in some of the reflection activities. Are there any questions about these norms? Okay. So our first activity is going to be around setting an intention. It's important for us to think about how we want to show up and engage with this material today. So I'm going to ask you to intentionally set an intention for this next 2 hours that we're going to spend together. So you may want to think about what you hope to gain from this training series when you think about your intention. What you hope to give or offer in this training series, whether that is you want to share something specifically related to the content and the material. And then what are my overall intentions today? Do I want to learn something new? Do I want to reinforce something that is already known? Do I want to contribute at least one question or an idea during the session? So take a few moments now to set a concrete intention. And I will say we're going to revisit this at the end of our training session. Now that we have our intention, we're going to start with why. Why is a focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion important? And we're going to start by listening and hearing and watching a little bit of this video that talks a little bit about the importance of a focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. As you're listening, I want you to listen and identify things that stick with you from what you hear. And let me know if you cannot hear.
When we talk about the future of work and we talk about what would happen if we don't move on diversity, equity, and inclusion, I don't honestly think that there is a future that's possible.
Studies have shown that more diverse teams tend to perform better, and many companies have made commitments to hiring a more diverse workforce. Yet creating inclusive work cultures that are truly equitable and free of bias remains a formidable challenge for companies, especially since some of the biggest obstacles are the very employees they are trying to change.
One of the challenges in this space is that people do have really strong feelings about what they should do and what's right, but the strategies that organizations have used pretty much universally are not effective. They're ineffective and sometimes make things worse.
So many of us have incredible intentions but terrible actions. And unless you can get your intention and your action to align, then your intention is in vain.
But there may be actions that companies and their employees can take that can mean change is finally starting to happen.
If business would step in and do this work, I think it would change society outside of the walls of business. And yes, it is disruptive. Technology was disruptive. Think about the companies that said, we don't really want to touch technology. They're not here anymore. But from the disruption comes change.
So there's a very strong link between companies who are strong at diversity, equity, and inclusion and increased organizational performance.
This is Dr. David Rock. He's the CEO and co-founder of the Neuro Leadership Institute, a consultancy company that advises organizations on management strategies based on science and evidence-based practices.
The most kind of salient way to understand this is that we all see the world very, very differently. And when you get a homogeneous team, or a team that's all basically the same, they actually make more cognitive errors. They don't see errors that other people have made, and they're far less creative and far less innovative than a diverse team.
While these diverse groups may be more efficient, creative, and faster at finding and solving problems, they often feel like they are being less efficient and less confident in their work, partly due to a phenomenon called cognitive elaboration.
Which is a long word for saying you're going to think harder. The teams are thinking harder, thinking is generally aversive, and so we feel more confident and comfortable in teams that are more homogeneous, where people basically agree with us all the time. And it turns out that feels good, but the team is nowhere near as successful.
If companies want to see the positive effects of a diverse and inclusive workforce, they need to find ways to mitigate that naturally occurring friction. Essentially, they need to have their employees be comfortable being uncomfortable.
In business, we go to work, we do our jobs, and we leave. And we are so weary of pushing against the grain with a colleague, with a coworker, with an employer, et cetera, with an employee. And I think if we truly want to grow and get to know each other better, we do have to embrace some of that uncomfortable dialogue for the sake of growth.
Any thoughts or reflections on this video, what you heard, anything that stuck with you?
I really like the one speaker who said that, I don't know who he phrased it towards, but a lot of us have great intentions and terrible actions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he also touched on the importance of trying to move to a place of alignment to make sure that our intentions and our actions are lining up.
I'd like.
Oh, go ahead.
That's okay, Diana. Did you have something?
I was just going to say something about cognitive elaboration, and did he stop there, or is this what we're doing? Cognitive elaboration.
Well, hopefully we're moving into the space where we are doing it. He was talking about how when there are, there's a diversity among the team and you're having to get into that process of thinking harder because of the diverse ideas and diverse perspectives that are at the table. Natalie, you were going to share something?
The same. I was going to say I liked that idea of cognitive elaboration, although I took it to mean, maybe I misunderstood, but the thinking harder seems like you can think less harder when you have a diverse staff because you're not trying to like reinvent wheels or make things up. Like there's lots of different perspectives, but then I understand like that does make you think harder because there's more to think about.
Mm-hmm. And it can feel, because you're engaging in a different way and there's a multitude of ideas and concepts, you're making less errors, but you're thinking harder. And so it feels like you're not moving as fast or as quickly as you might want to.
Mm-hmm.
JC, you were going to say something?
Yeah, like the human brain, right, doesn't stay stagnant. It's either growing or it's pruning. And if we're not challenging ourselves, then it's pruning stuff. And it, seems very parallel to that. And, if we're not going to challenge ourselves and grow and move forward, then things are going to continue to deteriorate. I just kind of saw that parallel.
Thank you for that. And so this work is calling us to move into a space that might feel uncomfortable. It might feel different, but it's leading us towards a positive outcome. So why is a focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion important? So I'm going to share some benefits of DEI in the workspace. I'm going to share some benefits of DEI when we think about leadership. So we have, and we heard this in the video, there's diverse perspectives, companies that focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion also see reductions in employee turnover. There's also higher employee engagement in spaces where there's a focus, and this is an integrated adaptive focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So this is not talking about when we're just checking off a box for the purpose of checking off a box. We're talking about integrated, functioning focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. There's increased creativity, which is something that Natalie was also pointing to that she heard in the video. And then an increased motivation, and because people identify that there is equal access to opportunities within the organization. And when we think about diversity and equity and inclusion in a leadership space, what we're seeing is that it breeds innovative and responsive solutions and decision-making. There's a sense of trust and psychological safety that staff report experiencing when there's a focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion within the leadership. There's also a demonstrated increased awareness on behalf of the leadership. So being more aware of ideas, challenges, expansive and creative approaches to different things. And then there's also a greater breadth and depth of experience. So more people coming to the table with a variety of experiences, variety of approaches, and variety of viewpoints. And having this breadth and depth of experience also results in increased capacity for connection within an organization, connection between leadership and staff, and then also connection with communities that are being served. Any reactions or responses to either hearing about either of these places where you see benefits? Go ahead, Jason.
I just wanted to say, right, in education, we talk about how having relationships with your students, especially in early childhood, right? Like having relationships with your students and a true relationship, not just like, their name and like, who they play with, but that you really know who they are and who they respect, or, who they are and what they're bringing to the table brings a lot of respect into the relationship. And I have only worked in an office situation or like in, this experience at Ridgeville, that's been a very small percentage of my life, but it's not that different. When we are either a staff or, when the campers come, when we're interacting with people in the community, if we're truly seeing them for who they are and everything that they're bringing, that relationship is so much more respectful. And thus there's the increased capacity for connection and response. Which I, think is what we're really trying to do at the Park District, is having that connection and that response to the community.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And I would say that relationship is foundational to all of this work and what we should all be thinking about and having top of mind when we're talking about how to create communities, initiatives, and policies that consider diversity, that consider equity, that consider inclusion, that it is about building and bridging connection and relationships within the organization, among the people that you sit next to, and then with the community that you serve. Other reactions or responses to thinking about the benefits of diversity, equity, and inclusion?
I have a response, and hopefully I'm on the right page here. But growing up in Evanston, especially where I grew up on the far west side, it was a very diverse neighborhood, and we all got along fantastically. In the summer months, we played together every day. The difference was, as you got older, adults were introduced into your group, and that's when the differences started to be relevant or identified. Somebody's mother, somebody's father had an issue or whatever, and it kind of ruined that week of the summer, maybe. But the key that just woke me up a little bit was relationship is the foundation of all of this. The relationship with child to child was awesome. When adults back in that era, like I said, got involved, it all changed a little bit. There was a little aggravation to daily routine. We had a blast, and then parents got involved, and it all kind of changed as we got older.
Thank
Then I
you.
went to Evanston High School, and I had it made in the shade because I came from two different worlds. I came from West Evanston Summers and then St. Nicholas School in the academic year. So it was two different groups entirely. But I thought I benefited tremendously from that when I got to high school. I say when I got to the high school because it was the only high school in town. So the relationship is the foundation of all of this. Struck a chord with me.
Thank you for sharing that. So I'm going to move us forward. So there are isms. So and I will say that there isn't a hierarchy here to the isms. All discrimination is bad. But we know that there's sexism, there's ageism, classism, heterosexism, ableism, racism. And I'm saying this as we shift into talking about and looking at racial equity, and again, remind us of the reason that we start with race is because of that intersection. That when that intersection happens with race, there's a significant impact that happens when race is overlaps with these other identifiers, which calls on us to focus on and bring specific attention to starting with race and racial equity. So what we know is that there are institutional and structural disparities that exist in this country and that are faced by people of color. Institutional racism also results in inequity when we look at success and wellness indicators, that there is a significant impact when we layer and talk about race and how that impacts existence in our society. The other thing to really think about, racism is a barrier. It's a barrier to communities coming together. It's a barrier to unity. It is a barrier to moving forward and thinking about taking collective action amongst varied communities. And so when we think about addressing racism and focusing on race equity and engaging in strategies that are really anti-racist, that has the capacity to have positive impacts across all of those isms that we just talked about: classism, sexism, ableism. When we focus on anti-racist strategies, it positively impacts everyone in our communities. It's also a focus on race, and race equity is responsive to the needs of the RPD community as well. I do want to pull out intersectionality really briefly just to talk about this idea, because this is what I'm talking about when I talk about that overlay of identities. And the roots of intersectionality come from Kimberly Crenshaw originally, and it came out of feminist theory. And it's the idea of overlapping, or what she called intersecting, social identities and how those identities relate to systems of power, oppression, domination, and discrimination. The important thing to point out is that we all have multiple identities. And if you take a moment and just reflect on the cultural identifiers that make up who you are, whether they're visible or invisible, they all overlap and intersect. So I am a Black person. I am a Black woman. I am an African-American woman. Those are intersecting identities that impact the way that I navigate the world, and also in some circumstances impacts the way that the world interacts and engages with me. So the intersection of the isms and the impact of race is really something, the reason that we start with this focus on race equity. And intersection is about that combination of privilege and oppression. This is a very long quote, so I'm going to give you a moment to read through it. This comes specifically directly from Kimberly Crenshaw, and she was talking about this transition of this idea, because the concept of intersectionality started out of feminist theory, and then it blossomed into a way that other communities who were experiencing erasure in our society were able to see themselves in a new way, and see their struggles be highlighted in a new way because of the concept of intersectionality. Does someone want to read this out loud for everyone as well?
I can read it if you'd like.
Okay.
Intersectionality is an analytic sensibility, a way of thinking about identity and its relationship to power. Originally articulated on behalf of Black women, the term brought to light the invisibility of many constituents within groups that claim them as members, but often fail to represent them. Intersectional erasures are not exclusive to Black women. People of color within LGBTQ movements, girls of color in the fight against the school to prison pipeline, women within immigration movements, trans women within feminist movements, the people with disabilities fighting police abuse, all face vulnerabilities that reflect the intersections of racism, sexism, class oppression, transphobia, ableism, and more. Intersectionality has given many advocates a way to frame their circumstances and to fight for their visibility and inclusion.
I know that was a lengthy quote. Any thoughts or reflections on this idea of intersectionality?
So is this, the idea of intersectionality is only people who are marginalized?
Well, we all experience intersectionality. You could probably, when you think of yourself, but the importance of this is to highlight how specific identities are typically erased. And that's when we think about people who are marginalized.
I see.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to shift us now into talking about the equity charter and just giving a brief sort of reminder to, again, this is the why, ground us in why we're here, why we're showing up to do this work. So the charter was created in response to the needs of the community, and the charter was adapted by the board, and the Ready Committee then was developed to support and expand the capacity of the Board of Commissioners to address issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion. I pulled out 3 key places that are important for us to highlight. One, the role, and this is again, bridging that connection between the committee and the board to understand the historic and current drivers of social inequity. And we're talking about racism, sexism, we're talking about the isms. 2, to identify how RPD contributes to and deconstructs these inequities. And then also aiding in how we work in partnership with the communities that we serve. Any thoughts or reflections about the charter? This is just a brief highlight and touch point on the equity charter.
I feel like Ridgeville in particular works in partnership with many of the communities that we're serving in the area within the the sports that are offered, the gardening that's offered to everybody, which is one of the things I really like about Ridgeville.
Thank you for that. Highlighting a strength.
In the opposite direction, I think to get to the heart of this, we need to understand the historic factors and historic missteps of Ridgeville as an organization. And in my time, I've heard people have kind of a visceral reaction to that, right? That like Ridgeville was racist in the past. Well, we live in America. Everything in America is racist. America history is racist. Like it's not a surprise. But I think until you really address the historic drivers, it's hard to move forward.
Thank you for that. So pointing to, again, that first point of understanding the importance of knowing where we've been in order to ensure that we don't go back there, and to make sure that we're on a path that is leading us to a different and a better direction. Other comments or reactions?
I think this is so useful, specifically number 2, to identify how RPD contributes to and can deconstruct these inequities. Until we had developed the Ready Committee and started working with Dr. Effiam, I'm not sure that I fully understood systemic racism and what all that meant, and how we contribute to that individually and as an institution. So it's been really productive for me to learn that over the past couple of years, and to continue moving forward in a way that helps us identify and deconstruct.
Thank you for that.
Do you have an example, Natalie, of how this was seen at Ridgeville?
Yeah, there, okay, for example, and this, so at one point we had some folks that were coming to board meetings to speak and citizen comment about some experiences that they had had at Ridgeville, but also in Evanston, not in Evanston growing up. They were sharing a lot of really traumatic stories from youth, and probably more recently too, but specifically somebody that had lived within the district mentioned that like when flyers had been passed out in the past, it seemed like her building was specifically being left out of like papering, like putting flyers up, and impact versus intent, right? I don't know that the building was left out necessarily for, I don't know why, and this was before I was there, and I think maybe even, I don't know, but regardless, the impact of that was, it felt like her building that had a lot of Black community members living there, it felt targeted and specific to them, that they weren't invited to our programs. So that was an example of something that had been brought up at a past board meeting, and there were lots of different stories as well.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. I think the, sorry, one other quick thing. I think the conversations we're having within the Ready Committee right now about the basketball courts is one too. And we can, that's a long history. I'm not sure that we have time to get into it today, but there's a long history there with citizens coming and citizens coming to, as basketball players to talk to us about issues, neighbors that live around the courts coming to talk to us as issues, but really kind of breaking that down in the Ready Committee right now and figuring out how we can make it equitable for the players and for the neighbors is really important. So we're working to put language together, and a lot of it is just really about transparency and explaining how things happen and why. But I think that's another example of institutional racism that has existed, that we're trying to that we know we've been contributed to and we're trying to deconstruct and make more equitable.
And we'll touch in session 3 on that issue specifically. So we'll come back to it. It'll resurface. Okay. So in order for us to do this work, we have to be into creating spaces for conversation and change. And so we're going to talk and spend a little bit of time with thinking about how can that happen? How do we do that? And I think it's really important for us to understand that creating space for conversations and change is a key component to this work. And it requires us to be in a place of intention. And we started this session with identifying intention. That's a tool for us to take with us as we leave this training and think about the work ahead. Setting intention is a critical tool and something that you can use in order to create space for conversation and enacting change. Also talking about norms, creating agreements about how we show up and how we're willing to be present in space together is also a tool that we have access to. Creating space for conversation and change is also critical to shaping how we get to the outcomes that we get to. We can drag people along, we can avoid reaching a specific place, or we can come to the table as collaboratives and create space for the diversity of voices, diversity of opinions, diversity of ideas to get to the outcomes that we want to reach. And then it also requires us to have knowledge and information. And part of this training process is trying to create a space for us to be getting some knowledge and information about how to do this and how to do this work. Yes.
Aisha, could you elaborate more about creating space as a concept, as like a place or an idea or a value?
It's all of those things. We're going to spend a little bit of time right now talking about how to do it. So creating space can be everything from bolstering the work of the Ready Committee, which is creating an actual and literal space for work to be done, creating space between peers and colleagues where you're engaging in these conversations, creating outlets for the community to have a voice. All of those things are part of this idea and concept around creating space for conversation and change.
Thank you.
Before we get into really talking about how we ourselves show up, we are going to talk about mindfulness. This is another tool. Sometimes we come to these spaces and these conversations can be charged, and they're charged because we're bringing in parts of our identity. We may be thinking about things that have happened to us in the past, thinking about things that are happening to us currently. And mindfulness is connected to equity work because it allows us to increase and enhance our capacity to show up in a different way when we are engaging and connecting with others. So what mindfulness does is it's a core concept used to help us reframe and reinterpret unfamiliar behavior or ways of communicating to understand rather than to judge. And it also can be used to reinterpret familiar behavior so that we have a different understanding about a concept or something that we thought we knew, and creates a space for us to identify a new way to think about terms and concepts. When we practice this skill of mindfulness, it also encourages us to practice non-judgmental observation. And it helps us move away from making quick judgments, quick assumptions, and move into a space of being more mindful about how we respond, how we react, and how we show up and engage. So this is going back to the idea of relationship that we were just talking about. And so in order to be in an effective relationship with other people, we have to be very aware, keenly aware of how we're showing up in those spaces and how we are open and how we're responding and responding to and receiving information. So mindfulness meditation also just in general helps to reduce anxiety. It can improve our emotional regulation. And again, when we're thinking about some conversations or decisions around diversity, equity, and inclusion, they can have a charge to them. And so if we're coming from a place and practicing mindfulness, it can help us to regulate our emotions. So then we have the capacity to shift ourselves into thinking brain instead of feeling brain, and then make decisions that are a little bit more grounded. And has the capacity to increase our compassion as well as increase empathy. And it also has the capacity to reduce negativity bias. So as humans, we have this natural tendency towards negativity. When we are in a position or a space that feels uncomfortable or is unfamiliar, we have a natural tendency to draw out and pull out the things that are negative about that situation and about that circumstance. And so what mindfulness has the capacity to do, if we get into a regular practice of that, is to slow down and to take in more information than just the natural tendency towards that negative bias or negative assumption. So I'm a dance move therapist, as I shared. So we are going to practice some mindfulness. And again, this is a tool that we'll walk away with after this training and this session, and it is directly connected to our equity work and our equity journey.
And our life.
And our life. So I'm going to ask that you find a comfortable position. And I'll ask that you place your feet on the floor if you can. And you can either close your eyes or find a lowered point to focus on. You could just focus on the words that are on the screen. You could focus on the image that's on the screen. And I'd like you just to take a moment to notice your body in your chair or your seat, your couch, wherever you're seated. Notice places where there is tension. Notice places where there's relaxation. Just taking a moment for awareness, just being aware, not shifting or changing anything, just being aware of the sensation of your feet planted on the floor. You might notice the sensation of your socks or shoes. You might notice the surface of the floor beneath your foot. Take a moment to notice the weight of your body in the chair that you're sitting in. And then I'm going to ask that you place your palms either on the tabletop or maybe on your thighs, open and upward towards the ceiling. And notice any shift that happened in your body with that change. You might notice your spine against the back of your chair if there's a back there. You might notice your upper back, your lower back. You might notice your shoulder blades. And I want you to take a moment just to shift your attention to your breath. Noticing if your breath is deep if your breath is shallow. Just being aware of how you're breathing in this moment. Notice your heart rate. Notice the rate of each breath. And with that noticing, your breath may have naturally began to deepen. And if that happens, allow it to occur. If it doesn't, no need to shift, change, or adjust anything. You may notice thoughts come. If they do, allow them to be, and then draw your focus back to your breath. And now I'll ask you to place one hand on your chest and one hand on your belly. And notice that shift. Notice if there was a shift in your posture. Notice if you can feel and sense your heart rate. Notice the temperature of your palms and the weight of your hands. And from this posture, we'll be taking a few breaths together. We'll be breathing in through our nose and breathing out through our mouth. So take a moment and take a few breaths on your own, and then we will take some collective breaths together. Breathing in through your nose. And breathing out through your mouth. Breathing in through your nose. And out through your mouth. 2 more breaths that way, breathing in. And breathing out. 1 more breath, breathing in. And breathing out. And I'd like you again to draw your attention to your spine. Noticing the weight of your body in your chair. Noticing your feet, the floor. You might notice your socks, your shoes. You might notice the surface of the floor. And then again, returning your attention to your breath. How am I breathing in this moment? And I'd like to invite you to do another quick scan, noticing places where there is stress and tension. And inviting breath to circulate through those places. Noticing places where there's relaxation. And taking a few final moments here. Just to connect with your breath. And when you feel ready, you can release your hands. If your eyes were closed, you can blink your eyes open. And in opening your eyes, you'll notice light, colors, shapes. You'll notice things around you in your environment. And take a few moments to give your body what it needs in this moment. You might need to stretch, you might need to yawn, you might need to take more breath. How was that? Oh,
That was, oh, sorry, Diana.
Diana, you're muted.
I said it created a lot of yawning.
Yeah.
It did, which made my eyes water a lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
Your bodies were yearning for more oxygen, more breath, more flow.
Aisha, can we do this every day? Maybe I can listen to the recording every day. I've got my cat water fountain in the background, so I had a water feature noise, and it was very nice. Thank you.
Any shift that you notice in yourself after spending a few moments with breath, and anything that you notice about yourself in that brief moment of just connecting to yourself?
I relaxed and I felt it in my neck, into my head, not my shoulders so much. Then when I put my hands on the table, I didn't yawn, but my body reacted with a large intake of oxygen. And it was very relaxing.
Good. Thank you for that.
The motion of putting your hand on your chest is such a calming motion for me. That's a trick I had learned in grad school before I would go on stage for performance, was if I was feeling anxious, just to take a moment and reconnect with my breath by putting my hand on my chest, and it makes such a big difference.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
I feel more present.
Oh.
I feel more present. My body is relaxed, but end of the day, end of the work day, coming in, I was stressed, rushing to get here. My mind was kind of moving fast, and I feel more here.
Thank you for that. JC, you were going to share.
That's essentially the same thing that I was going to say, right? Like it's been a long week. I'm pretty sure there might have been 2 of them in here, even though we had Monday off of work. But I think it was the first time that I really realized how tired I am. And kind of giving myself permission just to be that, and not feel like I really have to keep pushing myself for the rest of the day.
Thank you for that. So this practice, although before you engage in a conversation that might be uncomfortable or difficult, you might not do all of that, but connecting to your breath, or as Natalie was talking about, in a moment where you're feeling nervous or feeling charged, reminding yourself of connecting to your breath to be more centered, more grounded, can be useful and helpful when we're navigating these conversations that may feel uncomfortable, conversations that may feel different because they're new and they need to happen. So from this place, we're going to do a little bit of personal reflection. So going back to that page, possibly where you wrote your intention, and we're going to think about, when we think about this idea of having conversation, holding space for conversations about race and racism, what comes up when you think about this concept of opening up space for difficult conversations or what can feel like conflict, what comes up? And then this last question, what conversations are needed when you think about diversity, equity, and inclusion? I also included accessibility here, and there's a definition there of accessibility. When we think about DEIA and Ridgeville. And this is personal reflection. So take a few moments to reflect on these questions. We'll take one more minute. Okay, I will create some space here in case there is anyone who wants to share. You can share verbally, you can share in the chat. You also do not have to share, but I do want to create space in the event someone wants to share responses to any of these prompts.
Can I share it real quick?
Yes.
What comes up when you think about holding space for conversation about race and racism? In my mind, I wrote my notes, I don't completely understand both sides of race and racism. And that's what can get misunderstood in conversations. It's not necessarily a negative conversation, but it's a product of not completely understanding both sides or opposite sides.
Thank you for that. Thank you for sharing that.
Go for it.
No, this time it's your turn.
Something that comes up for me a lot with this specifically in engaging in conversation, discussion, and decision-making around DEI and the difficult conversations and conflict. And this will be a work in progress my entire life, but I have to and the mindfulness exercise is such a good exercise before we talk about this. I have to separate my own ego and like feelings that I have when we're talking about things like systemic racism or occurrences that have happened. And I'm going to use Ridgeville as an example because that's what we're talking about. Because I know that I would never intentionally do anything that would cause harm or be racist. But just because I would never intend to do that doesn't mean I haven't or I don't. So, or that before me, that it hasn't happened. It's not intrinsically built into the organization because we are an organization in America that is built on racism. So having those kinds of conversations, I'm still working on separating myself, my ego from that piece of it so that I can like fully listen and fully engage and be capable of having the difficult conversation and conflict resolution from a place of anti-racism and wanting to create equity. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you for sharing. I think that also connects back to one of the norms about really could be stating intention and also at the same time owning impact. That and the video originally too, where sometimes intention and action may not line up, and creating space to honor that and being open to shift and change when that is revealed and we need to make a shift or a change. Thank you for sharing. Diana?
Well, I don't know where I'm going with this, but something I read recently is that the Human Genome Project showed that the element of race in human beings is very small and hard to identify in that genome project, but that what we think about of race is ethnicity and cultural background. And I don't know where to go with that. I guess I'm just sharing that, thinking about race and racism.
Mm-hmm. And social constructs and how society deems or determines what is built in or attached to specific racial categories and racial identities.
And how we align with those things too. You know, that we're different races. We're white, we're black, we're brown, whatever. It's really very not really existent scientifically. So, or such a small portion of us as humans. I don't know. I'm just thinking about these things.
Thank you for sharing. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about this idea of difficult conversation. And really when we're talking about difficult conversation, most times we're talking about something that makes us uncomfortable. And having to engage in a conversation or decision-making and thinking about concepts in a space where there's a level of discomfort. Oftentimes, discomfort can be a signal that there's something to be learned and a space for us to move into new territory. So some of the factors that can make a conversation, the idea of a conversation difficult is, our experience and our history, what we're coming into, what we're bringing to the table, what we've been through, our skills and our confidence level. So how equipped we feel to actually engage in a conversation when it's something that makes us feel uncomfortable or we feel like we don't have all of the information or all of the answers. Relationship, and we talked a little bit about that when we don't have that relationship with the person that we're engaging with. Priorities, hopes, values, concerns, and fears. Power dynamics as well, whether they're perceived or they actually exist, can also make conversations difficult or uncomfortable. And then this idea of stereotype threat. which we'll touch on a little bit later. So conflict and difficult conversations. So one, all difficult conversations and conflicts are not synonymous. Conflict can be a component of a difficult conversation, and then conflict management is something that we can use as a strategy to help us engage when we're in something that we're perceiving as a difficult conversation or an uncomfortable conversation. We're going to take a few minutes here to assess our own conflict management strategies. And I'm going to try to put this link in the chat so that everyone can take this assessment. So there's many assessments out where you can identify what your conflict management skill is or how you engage in conflict management. This is just the one that we are doing today. So everyone should have access to that in the chat. And I'm going to put it back on the screen. The location of the, so take a few minutes here. This is that awareness piece. We want to be going into decision-making conversations with as much awareness of ourselves as we possibly can. So let's assess our conflict management style. One more minute. So hopefully everyone has gotten through or is close to getting through. And one of the things that you'll find at the end are different conflict management styles categorized by animals. So there is the owl, who values their goals and their relationships. The turtle, who tends to avoid confrontation. The sharks that value their goals over the relationships. The teddy bear, which is accommodating, values relationships over their own goals. And then the fox, which is a compromising conflict management style. So moderately concerned about both their goals and their relationships with others. What are some thoughts about, well, first, before we even talk about thoughts about why this might be helpful, how was it to look through some of these categories and to take the survey to try to get a look at how you manage conflict? Were there things that were confirmation? Were there things that were surprising?
I think I finally admitted to myself that I'm a people pleaser. I don't like, as the third of three girls, I do not like admitting that. But I have to, it was also, I found it kind of amusing, right? How you argue or not argue with someone, so many of those behaviors are rooted in the culture within we were raised. And coming from a Brazilian family where like all the kids in my family were girls and most of the kids in my mom's family were girls, like, this is something that we take very seriously in terms of making sure our voices are heard. So there was a bit of humor too, of like kind of reading through and being like, I got to own up to some of this.
Thank you for sharing that. I think it's also, there's that family culture. And then when we think about society and what culture deems as acceptable when you look at cultural identifiers, as far as how certain people are allowed to manage conflict in our society, is also important piece to point out and think about. There was someone that was going to make a comment.
I have a quick one.
Okay.
I recently completed my first year of professional development school with the IPRA, and we had to take the Clifton Strengths test before we got there because we spent the first day talking about our strengths. And all of my strengths were in relationship building, which was cool. But for all of it, my conflict across the board was like my weakest quality. And so it's interesting to take something like this, knowing that I have a hard time with conflict, and figure out what kind of conflict management style will be useful for me to get through that, because I feel like that's just an ongoing learning experience for me. But I'm a collaborator and compromiser per this test.
Thank you.
Thank you for bringing that test.
Any other thoughts about this? Why when we think about this type of assessment and the topic at hand, navigating racial equity, difficult conversations, might this be this type of evaluation of ourselves or awareness of ourselves? Why might it be important?
Because what you say opens the conversation or closes it. Mm-hmm. Or how you handle it. Mm-hmm. Whether both people have a say-so or you just do, or I just do.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that.
I find myself less compromising with males than females. And it might come from sports, it might come from older brothers, but if it's a male worker, I cut to the chase a lot quicker, put it that way, a male employee, or that's something I noticed a long time ago. Easier to cut to the chase in a conflict situation with a male than a female.
So, go ahead, Natalie.
I was just going to say, thank you, Brian. I appreciate that about you.
Yeah.
Also, Aisha, in terms of talking about DEI and this kind of assessment, I can say just from a staff perspective, when community members are coming to us with issues regarding race, it's never like casual sit down conversation about, let's talk about some race issues that have come up at the park. There's usually a lot of passion behind it, which is understood. But so very rarely as staff are you approached in like a super calm, let's sit down and have a chat way about these things. So I think it's important to understand how to manage like your management style with this so that you can have really productive conversations and listen.
Thank you for that. So let's talk about how to navigate these conversations. One of them is understanding your own approach to managing conflict, or when you're in a situation that you perceive to have conflict as a part of it. And engaging what works for you to reach the resolution. But it's also equally important for us to be invested in learning alternatives that may work better, if they work better, given different situations. So not only is it important for us to be aware of our personal approach to conflict management and how we resolve conflicts, it's also important for us to be aware of other styles and approaches that people have to how they navigate conflict. And that brings us back to that place of relationship and that foundational place that we can work from. When we're navigating difficult conversations or uncomfortable conversations, it's also important to understand why the conversation is important to you. So what about this conversation? Where can you find the value in it? And it's also equally important to understand the value for the other person on the other side as well. So stepping into the shoes of the person that you're engaging in the conversation with. So we also want to be thinking about communicating, and this idea of grit comes from the link is on the bottom of the slide there. So thinking about communicating with generosity, communicating with respect, communicating with integrity, and communicating with truth. So when we're thinking about this concept, we want to be intentional. We want to be prepared. We want to be open. We want to be realistic. And we also want to be mindful. So when we're talking about being intentional, we're talking about identifying and expressing the intention for the conversation with the audience. Being prepared. So if we are engaging in a conversation and the capacity is there, doing some pre-work and making sure that we've thought out supports or identified resources connected to the area in the event that we have any questions. Being open, so assuming a posture of listening and really listening to hear versus listening to respond. We also want to create the space where we're being transparent and authentic in our engagements and interactions. Then also being realistic, understanding that the answer may not come in one conversation, or you may not reach a resolution right in that moment, that there might be a part of this that's a process and a journey. And then the other piece of this is being mindful about health and mental health. This is especially important for people of marginalized communities who are either the initiators of the conversations or engaged in the conversation, because they're coming in and from a place where they may be frequently managing things like microaggressions, oppression, discrimination. And so this creating space to hold the space for a conversation that is charged can have a different weight. So there's an idea around moving from the thought of being having conflict resolution to moving into conflict transformation. And conflict transformation, it comes out of restorative justice, restorative practice circles. And restorative practice draws from indigenous traditions that are around the thinking of really focusing on relationships. So restoring someone within the community to retain and restore and rebuild relationships versus isolating and separating when a wrong has been done. So the idea of conflict transformation comes from that. And I just wanted to touch on this idea a little bit because there are some things from conflict transformation that can be important when we think about integrating it into how we resolve conflict. So instead of rushing to resolve or simply trying to contain damage, conflict transformation is about repairing power imbalances, and it's about healing and focusing on relationships that may have been broken in order to, again, this idea of restoring the relationship, restoring imbalances that exist. And is also often impaired with restorative justice, which I touched on a little bit. And it seeks to make space for understanding how power functions in a conflict and how larger systems need to be addressed before individual relationships can be mended or improved. So there's a systemic approach and a viewpoint when we're talking about conflict transformation. Okay. So now we are going to shift into common language. So we've talked about setting an intention. We've talked about how to create a space for conversations. We've talked about how to prepare some elements of how we can prepare ourselves to navigate conversations. So increasing our awareness, engaging in mindfulness, how to create the space for conversations and decision-making to happen. And we're going to shift now into the common language piece. When we're in this conversation, engaging in these things, these are the things that we need to be aware of and have a thought towards. So we're going to, over the course of the next few sessions, we're going to talk about the idea and concept of anti-racism and anti-racist. Specifically, we're going to talk about what is an anti-racist organization. I will say these definitions are also available on the equity page that we're going to touch on. Then there's the idea of equity versus equality. We're going to talk about racial equality specifically. We're going to talk about racism. We're going to talk about the concept of white privilege. We're going to talk about bias and microaggressions. So this is to prepare us for what's to come. So we're going to get through a few of these definitions tonight, and some of the definitions are going to be supported by hearing some content or doing some reflection activities. Can someone read this definition of anti-racism? Out loud for everyone to hear.
Do you want me to read it?
Sure.
Anti-racism, an active approach to identification and elimination of racism by changing oppressive systems, structures, policies, practices that reinforce racism and racist practices.
Thank you. So the idea of anti-racism is about being in an active state. And I think sometimes there's a confusion around the concept of idea of saying that I'm not racist, but anti-racism is about taking it the next step further. So saying I'm not racist is great and it is wonderful, but it is not action oriented. And saying that I am anti-racist means that I am against it, and is also stating that you are a willing participant in creating a society that is actively against racism. We're going to read through what it means to be an anti-racist organization. Can someone read this slide?
I'll do it. An anti-racist organization is an organization that commits to the challenges of dismantling racism, has structured all aspects of institutional life to ensure full participation of people of color, including their culture, and the full participation of white people as allies in eliminating racism. Has the ability to recognize and address racism within the organization in a manner that builds strength, community, and trust, creates an organizational culture that is inclusive.
Can someone read this slide?
I can read this one. An anti-racist organization is an organization that goes beyond tolerating differences to respecting, seeking out, and embracing different approaches that are a result of employee diversity, implements policies and practices with inclusive decision-making throughout the organization, creates a culture of accountability, understands and addresses impact on racially oppressed communities.
So we're going to do another reflection. And so now that you have heard about what anti-racism is and what it means to be an anti-racist organization, I want us to think about, are there practices that you engage in that reflect those principles of what it is to be an anti-racist organization? Are there practices to consider to integrate that would or could align with these principles? When you think about the Park District in general, what practices reflect these principles? So take a few moments. I'm going to add this final question. Where or what are the areas for growth? And this is thinking about ourselves and also thinking about Ridgefield. Take 30 more seconds. I'm going to create space here in case anyone wants to share any reflections on these questions. Again, you can share out loud, you can use the chat, and you also do not have to share.
I'm excited that we are at a point where I feel like I actually know what this means, right? Like I know what our plan is to do this. We are in the process of doing part of it. I feel like, as the Ready Committee, we spent so long just kind of pulling ourselves together and becoming a committee. It feels really good to be at this point where we clearly haven't gotten a lot of work done, but to be at this point where like I know what this means. I know what we're doing. I even looking at the ordinances, I now know what to look for, right? Like I feel like we've done a lot of growth in being able to really reflect these principles. And I'm really excited about that and having this foundation to be able to move forward and do more.
Thank you for that.
Just kind of bounce off what JC said. I agree. I think the largest practice that we've engaged towards anti-racism is the development of the Ready Committee. And I think a lot more will get done a lot quicker because we're working together to do that. But I think it's also important to recognize some things that we've always had in place at Ridgeville that lean into anti-racism. I think the way we put together and prioritize our marketing material in a way that's representative and reflective of our community is important. I think conversations that we have within, like with our staff and with each other regarding parks and programs and policies. And I'm saying this just because I'm a person that has these conversations with Brian and Jung and other people all the time. I think there's a lot of the way we talk about these things and consider these things behind everything that we do at the park, I think is in the realm of moving towards an anti-racist institution. I think the way we staff our summer programs, our classes, even our permanent staff, if you look at all of us who work there year round, I think there's we have a really diverse group of folks at Ridgeville Park District, and I think that's also an indication of our work towards anti-racism.
Thank you for that.
Quickly, agree with a lot of what Natalie said. We're often have the same discussion every time a new program or policy or Ridgeville event takes place. Are we being inclusive? And we try to make sure we're doing that. Where and what are areas for growth everywhere? Because I go back to, I don't fully understand everything. I'm not where JC is. I'm not where Natalie is. I'm not where the Ready Committee is. So I have to ask these questions constantly.
Thank you.
Can I say one thing? Oh, I'm sorry. I just wanted to say one quick thing about area for growth. I think, and again, I think we're headed in the right direction. And thank you again for these trainings. I think something super important for us is that this kind of onboarding between staff and board and committee to do this specifically anti-racism training so that we are all using the same language and we are all prioritizing this work. And then as we bring in new staff, new board members, new committee members, making sure that they're coming in with that same kind of priority. And so I think that's one area where we definitely have room for growth, but like I see us moving in that direction and it's very exciting.
Thank you for that. I'm going to move us forward into equity and equality. Equity is about the fair and just treatment, access and opportunities for all people while building better outcomes for historically and currently disadvantaged populations. And equality is the state of being equal, especially in terms of rights, access, status, and opportunity. So it's important to point out that equality is good, and we're striving for equity, because equity recognizes and accounts for the fact that different people come from different circumstances, and so they may require different access to programs, services, resources. And so it takes into account that not everyone is starting off in an equal place. So it's not the idea that everyone gets the same. It's the idea that everyone's outcomes are the same, and we make adjustments in what we give as far as resources and access to ensure that everyone reaches the same outcomes. Racial equity. Can someone read this slide?
I can do it. Racial equity, both a process and an outcome. As a process, racial equity is doing the work to address root causes of inequities, not just their manifestation. This includes elimination of policies, practices, attitudes, and cultural messages that reinforce differential outcomes by race or that fail to eliminate them. This work must include those most impacted by structural racial inequity. They are meaningfully involved in the creation and implementation of the institutional policies and practices that impact their lives. As an outcome, we achieve racial equity when race no longer determines outcomes, when everyone has what they need to thrive.
Thank you for that. Okay. We're going to shift now to looking at racism. And this will be the last definition and term that we focus on tonight. Can someone read through just that heading, the top definition about racism?
I can read it.
Go ahead,
JC.
Natalie, you're better than I am at that stuff.
Oh
Go.
boy. Okay. Racism includes prejudice, discrimination, or hatred directed at someone because of their color, ethnicity, or national origin based on the belief that one's own race is superior.
Can someone read, maybe JC, can you read the points beneath it?
I sure can. The belief that all members of each race possess characteristics or abilities specific to that race, especially so as to distinguish it as inferior or superior to another race or races. Racism contributes to a system that provides privileges to those who are in the dominant group over those who are in the non-dominant group based on race. These privileges result in increased power and are reinforced through racial prejudice. Racism differs from implicit bias, which is conscious or unconscious prejudice against an individual or group based on their identity.
And we'll cover bias and implicit bias in our next session. So racism has multi-layered when we think about the types of racism that exist. And you can almost think about it in terms of an onion, and you can start peeling back the layers of it. So there's individual racism, which are the beliefs and attitudes that an individual supports and that perpetuates racism. So individual racism can be both unconscious and conscious level, and they can be both passive and aggressive. So this is me as an individual or a person as an individual. Then there's interpersonal racism, and that is when that person begins to interact with someone else. So bringing our personal beliefs on race into our interactions with others and engaging in discriminatory behaviors such as microaggressions. And we'll talk about and define what those are and what that is. And this can be intended or not. So again, that conscious or unconscious. And then there's institutional racism. So policies, practices, and behaviors within an organization or an institution that results in discrimination against people of color. We're going to take a moment and to view a conversation. I don't know if people have heard of the Seattle Project. Basically, what it is the Seattle Times, I believe it was, brought together a diverse group of people to have conversation around specific words. So such as what it means, what is an ally? What are microaggressions? What does all lives matter mean? What is politically incorrect? I will say these videos are from 2016, but as you hear them, they're still relevant. So all it is groups of people sharing their ideas and thoughts about this concept. And so while you're watching this video, I do want you to, again, think about what sticks with you, what do you hear, and what are you hearing from what's shared? Okay, let me know if you can hear.
Hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. You know, when they said all men, they weren't talking about all men.
We've been getting shot by the police since they let us off out of shackles. I mean, and then there's that slavery. I mean, I don't understand why we're talking about race and racism like it's something that just popped up.
Growing up as a white person in a purely white town, you only hear about individual racism. Systemic racism is where I see a lot of people who don't really understand. Like, a lot of people can try to dismiss it, but it's hard to dismiss systemic racism because it's math, it's data. People with white sounding names getting higher rates of callbacks on jobs, you have prison rates, you have housing discrimination.
The percentage of Black people among those that are incarcerated is really high. Like, the data is there. You can't deny that there is some institutional racism going on there.
You know, all these different statistics. The statistics are great, but they mean nothing without the context. If African American kids are more likely or less likely to do as well as white kids, I think we'd have to look at what causes that. Why? What is their environment? What's their family life like? What are the other things that are affecting that?
In order to say that there is an actual problem, we have to quantify it with actual measured proof. And so this idea that we have this feeling that this is happening, I'm sure it's happening somewhere, probably is happening. Black people are being arrested on a higher level. I don't agree. I think they may be committing crimes at a higher rate with a smaller demographic. I don't know if that's right.
I don't care where you're from, the numbers are staggering in terms of the amount of Black people getting shot by police, the incarceration rate. Even if we admit that Black people are more criminal, I'm not saying we should admit that, but even if we do, the numbers are still out of control, right? The numbers do not even add up to greater criminality statistically.
Institutional racism implies that there are different laws for different people, and there are no longer different laws. The law is the law, and it's now applied equally. I mean, you know, you would hope.
There's nothing necessarily in any of our policing policies that says you should be targeting people of color. But the outcome, right? We know that the outcome is that people of color are more likely to be stopped, they're more likely to be arrested, they're more likely to be sentenced, they're more likely to have longer sentences.
That alone ought to tell us we got a problem. So we don't have to have laws that enact it, or at least direct, blatant laws. We've got a system now that's built to keep that and to make it go.
They're a legacy of what once were really overt discriminatory acts, like preventing African Americans or any other person of any other race from buying property in a particular part of town, predatory lending, and access to education, and where schools are built, where grocery stores are built.
It's often not like a bunch of evil people sitting around in a room being like, we're gonna take all we can from this group of people. It's often the policies are written in a way that doesn't sort of encompass the disparities that currently exist, and so they then further those disparities.
There have absolutely been examples of institutionalized racism. Yeah. Goodness, Nazi Germany. And I think even in American history, we've had institutionalized racism 150 years ago. I'm not saying that there is no institutionalized racism. It's that right now, I'm not sure that what we are saying is institutionalized racism. I don't know that that's the right phrase for that.
I mean, like when I was using in the streets, like I got stopped for stuff I didn't do, but to say that it's this widespread systemic thing, I don't know. I know I stopped having trouble with the police though, like when I quit breaking laws.
I think that most people are speaking from experience. There has to be some historical, educational perspective.
We live in a country that is founded on really deep-seated bad history around race, from slavery to the Mexican-American War to the colonization of America and what that represents for our Native American community. Every slice of history that you look at in America has some sort of relation to race and oppression based on race and exclusion based on race.
People either don't have the historical context or deliberately do not want to have the context, but you've distanced yourself from the history of racism. You're able to not think of it as racism.
If we don't know our history, then we're bound to be ignorant about how we treat one another. So we need to teach the kids about slavery in the school system to say that this is really wrong, so that they're not raised in such a way that, that all is just kind of like a blind spot.
It's privilege plus power in a society, and that can be different from any society, but in ours, it happens to be white.
Racism is prejudice with privilege. It's structural, it's hereditary, and hereditary not like genetically, but you pass on values that are rooted in racism to your children, and that affects how they treat other people.
You go through the angry phase and you go through the protest phase in your life, and then you go through this place where you're just kind of numb, just like, this is getting worse than better, But you just have to take it upon yourself to educate as many people as you can.
So what are some reactions or responses? And that was a diversity of opinions and perspectives on this concept and idea of institutional racism. And as we heard them, there's the possibility that we heard opinions that are similar to our own, opinions that are different from our own, opinion that may be similar to people that we associate with, people in our family. What are some of the responses or reactions to that video?
It seemed pretty clear that everybody was speaking from their personal perspective. Like they had, skin in the game, so to say, and like they were very much speaking from the heart on like their own experience and perceptions. And I don't know that I'm to say. There were certain ones that I feel more inclined to, because I think they're more aligned with some of my own ideas, but I couldn't say that I listened to any of them speaking, and I would say like it's I think they were all valid perspectives because they were coming from a personal place.
I agree that most of it was, to me, very valid, except for the young African-American gentleman who said racism is hereditary. I don't think there's a child born in the world with racism bone in his body, but it may be taught as part of his culture. When I heard that, my head just shook. It's because that's not the way it is in a lot of households. It's not hereditary. It's taught. In my opinion, it happens over time. It's about your experiences, whether it's your home, your school, your neighborhood. That's what I believe.
He did go on to say that, Brian. Like after he said it was hereditary, he did clarify that not that it's born in you, but it's passed down from generation to generation, which is exactly what you just said.
I agree.
You actually agreed with him.
Matt, I think you unmuted.
I did. I appreciated the diverse perspectives that all recognized. You know, I think the unifying factor is that everybody recognized that there is such a thing as institutional racism, and that it's hard to define and hard to put your finger on. You know, personally, it makes sense to me very much in a historical perspective, and that we're living out the legacy of that. And different people touched on that in different ways.
Thank you for sharing. Diana, were you going to say something? I don't know if you had unmuted and then muted.
No, I was just trying to quiet my dog who's whining. Sorry.
So there was a diversity of perspectives and opinions, which likely mirrors a lot of what we all interact with on a daily basis, which means that is part of what happened to you, the things that stuck with you, the comments that reminded you of things, some of the thoughts or possibly rebuttals that you may have thought of while watching that video are things that are important to be aware of as we think about how we navigate these conversations and how we talk about institutional racism when we're looking at RPD and looking at what we're trying to do and the direction that we're trying to move into. So it is 8:30, and what I'm going to end us at this moment, but I'm going to ask that you revisit your intention that you set for the beginning of this session and take a moment just to reflect on, did I achieve it? Or were there different intentions that popped up along the time together? And I would say reflecting on, did I achieve my intention? It's neither without any judgment, whether you did or you did not, that it is what it is.
Are you asking for reflection?
You can share if you would like, similar to every discussion point. You can feel free to share or just to have it for yourself to know.
It's not that I didn't know it, but that film reminded me that entering any conversation, I have to know who the other person is, where their thinking is, and not to make the assumption that because we're in some kind of conversation or conflict, that I know what the other person has in their mind.
Thank you for that.
Aisha, one of my intentions for tonight was to gain further understanding of how I resolve conflicts. And we did that, so thank you.
Good. Others that want to share. Okay. Thank you all for your active engagement. It's 2 hours. How do we feel? Are we feeling okay? It was a lot of content, we moved through a lot of different spaces, and we'll continue on next week.
Great.
All right, have a good night. Or wait, how does this close out? JC.
I'll close us out. I do real fast before I let everyone go. Aisha, I want to thank you so much. I wasn't I'm excited how geared towards, like, specifically towards Ridgeville and towards like exactly what we're doing. This training was, it was really helpful, and I think it was really spot on. And I also want to say thank you to, everyone else who participated. Oftentimes in trainings like these, nobody wants to, really share their ideas or, be active participants. And the fact that you all were willing to be, I really appreciate that. It makes a better experience for all of us. And I think this will make a really good training video moving forward too, because we were involved. So I just want to say thank you to everyone for participating. Unless anyone else has anything they want to add real fast.
I think it went by so fast because everybody was participating.
It makes it more interesting. And when things are more interesting, you learn more.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really love how you've structured this, Aisha. I think starting with these conversations about why it's important and conflict and having difficult conversations, I think that stuff is all, and even the meditation, that stuff is so important to have under your belt before you go into the definitions and really talking about some of the heavier specific things to the park district. So thank you.
Thanks, Natalie.
Yeah, I agree with Natalie.
All right, fantastic, everybody. It is 8:35. Do we need I never remember. Do we need a vote to adjourn? Are we doing?
You can just say all in favor.
All in favor?
Aye.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
You too.
Have a great weekend, everybody.
Thank you, Aisha.
Thank you. Diana, tell Teddy I said goodnight.
Teddy's whining for something. I don't know why.
It's me. He wants to visit me. Bring him to the park.
Okay. I'll bring him to
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.